Throughout history, science has pushed boundaries, uncovering truths about the human mind, behavior, and society. But what happens when those boundaries are crossed? When experiments meant to enlighten us instead leave scars on individuals, on ethics, and on humanity itself? From secret government projects to manipulative psychological studies, some of the most famous experiments in history have a dark side that's rarely discussed. These experiments promised groundbreaking discoveries, insights into obedience, memory, prejudice, and even love. But behind the headlines and the textbooks lies a different story, one of deception, exploitation, and ethical failures. They've shaped the way we understand the world, but at what cost? And how much of what we think we know is actually true? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on some of the most controversial experiments in history. We'll uncover the untold truths, challenge the myths, and ask the tough questions: how far should science go in the name of discovery? And what do these experiments reveal about the darker side of human nature? But first, let's start with one of the most infamous studies of all time: a simulated prison that spiraled out of control in just 6 days. This is the Stanford Prison Experiment, the untold truth. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Imagine you're locked in a small, dark cell. The air is thick, and the only sound you hear is the clanging of a metal door. A man in a guard uniform stands over you, shouting orders. You're not a criminal, but you're treated like one. The line between reality and roleplay begins to blur. What would you do? How far would you go? This was the reality of the Stanford Prison Experiment, conducted in 1971 by psychologist Philip Zimbardo. The goal: to study how people conform to roles of authority and submission in a simulated prison environment. 24 college students were selected and randomly assigned to be either guards or prisoners. What started as a controlled study quickly spiraled into chaos. The guards, given uniforms, sunglasses, and batons, began to abuse their power. They humiliated and dehumanized the prisoners, forcing them to perform degrading tasks and endure psychological torment. The prisoners, stripped of their identities and referred to only by numbers, began to break down emotionally. Some rebelled, others became passive, and a few even begged to leave. The experiment, originally planned to last 2 weeks, was shut down after just 6 days. Why? The situation had become too real. The guards' cruelty escalated, and the prisoners' suffering was undeniable. Zimbardo himself admitted he had lost sight of the ethical boundaries. The Stanford Prison Experiment remains one of the most infamous studies in psychology. It revealed the dark side of human nature and how easily people can conform to roles of power and submission. But it also raised serious ethical questions: how far should science go in the name of discovery? And what does this experiment say about the systems of authority in our world today? The Milgram Obedience Experiment. What if you were told to follow orders, no matter the cost? Imagine this. You're in a small room, seated in front of a machine with switches labeled from mild shock to danger, severe shock. A man in a lab coat stands behind you, calmly instructing you to press the buttons. In the next room, you hear someone scream in pain, but the man insists you must continue. Would you obey? This was the chilling premise of the Milgram Obedience Experiment, conducted in 1961 by psychologist Stanley Milgram. The goal: to understand how far people would go in obeying authority, even if it meant harming another person. Participants were told they were part of a study on learning and memory. Their task was to administer electric shocks to a learner in another room whenever they answered a question incorrectly. What they didn't know was that the shocks weren't real, and the learner was an actor. As the experiment progressed, the shocks increased in intensity. The learner began to scream, beg for mercy, and eventually fell silent. Yet under the pressure of the authoritative figure, most participants continued to press the buttons, even when they believed they were causing serious harm. Astonishingly, 65% of participants delivered the maximum shock, despite their visible discomfort and hesitation. The results were shocking and deeply unsettling. Milgram's experiment revealed the dark side of human obedience and how easily people can be influenced by authority. But it also raised profound ethical questions. Was it right to deceive participants and subject them to such emotional distress? And what does this say about our capacity to resist authority in real-world situations? The little Albert experiment. Imagine a baby sits on a soft blanket, giggling as a fluffy white rat scurries by. Suddenly a loud, jarring noise echoes through the room. The baby freezes, his laughter replaced by tears. Over time, the sight of the rat alone is enough to make him cry. But it doesn't stop there. Soon anything white and fluffy terrifies him. What would you do if you were the one who caused this fear? This was the infamous little Albert experiment, conducted in 1920 by psychologist John B. Watson and his assistant Rosalie Rayner. The goal, to prove that fear is not innate but learned. They wanted to show how emotional responses could be conditioned, just like Pavlov's dogs salivating at the sound of a bell. Little Albert, an 11-month-old baby, was exposed to a series of stimuli, including a white rat, a rabbit, and a dog. Initially he showed no fear, but then Watson introduced a loud, frightening noise by striking a metal bar whenever Albert reached for the rat. The result? Albert began to associate the rat with the terrifying sound. Soon he cried at the mere sight of the rat, and even at other white, fluffy objects like a rabbit or a fur coat. The experiment was groundbreaking but deeply unethical. Little Albert was never desensitized to his fears, and his identity remains a mystery to this day. The study raised serious questions about the treatment of human subjects, especially vulnerable ones like children. The little Albert experiment changed the way we understand fear and conditioning, but at what cost? It forces us to ask, how far should science go in the name of discovery? The monster study. How speech therapy scarred orphans for life. Imagine you're a child in an orphanage, longing for love and acceptance. One day, an adult sits you down and tells you there's something wrong with you, that your words are broken, your speech is flawed, and you'll never be good enough. Over time, you start to believe it. You stop speaking, afraid of being judged. The world feels smaller, lonelier. Now imagine this wasn't an accident, it was an experiment. This was the reality for 22 orphans in 1939, during what is now known as the monster study, conducted by Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist at the University of Iowa. The experiment aimed to understand the effects of positive and negative reinforcement on children's speech. Half of the children were praised for their fluency, while the other half were harshly criticized and labeled as stutterers, even if they spoke perfectly. The results were devastating. The children subjected to negative reinforcement became withdrawn, anxious, and hesitant to speak. Some developed lifelong speech problems, while others carried the emotional scars of the experiment for years. The study was never published, likely due to its unethical nature, but its impact on the children was irreversible. The monster study is a chilling reminder of the emotional toll experiments can take on vulnerable populations. It raises profound ethical questions. Should the pursuit of knowledge ever come at the expense of a child's well-being? And how do we ensure that science never crosses such a line again? This experiment forces us to confront the darker side of research and reflect on the balance between discovery and humanity. The Tuskegee syphilis study. In the 1930s, the United States was gripped by the Great Depression. Poverty and racial inequality were rampant, especially in the rural South. For African American communities, access to healthcare was almost non-existent. It was in this context that the U.S. Public Health Service launched what they called a study in Macon County, Alabama. But what began as a promise of free medical care turned into one of the darkest chapters in medical history. The Tuskegee syphilis study, which began in 1932, aimed to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in African American men. Over 600 black men were recruited, 399 with syphilis and 201 without. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a vague term used to describe various ailments. In reality, they were given placebos like aspirin, while the disease ravaged their bodies. The study continued for 40 years. Even after penicillin was discovered as an effective cure for syphilis in the 1940s, the men were deliberately denied treatment. Researchers wanted to see how the disease would progress, regardless of the suffering it caused. Many participants died, went blind, or experienced severe health complications. Worse, their families were also affected, as the disease was passed on to spouses and children. The The study was finally exposed in 1972, sparking outrage and leading to its termination. It became a symbol of medical racism and unethical research practices. The fallout led to stricter ethical guidelines, including the creation of informed consent laws and the National Research Act. The Tuskegee syphilis study is a haunting reminder of the consequences of valuing science over humanity. How do we ensure such atrocities never happen again? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. David Reimer gender experiment. In the 1960s, the world was grappling with questions about identity, gender, and the influence of nature versus nurture. It was during this time that psychologist Dr. John Money proposed a radical idea that gender identity was entirely shaped by upbringing, not biology. This theory would lead to one of the most tragic and controversial experiments in medical history. David Reimer was born in 1965 as Bruce Reimer, one of two identical twin boys. At just 8 months old, a botched circumcision left Bruce without a functional penis. Desperate for answers, his parents turned to Dr. Money, who saw this as the perfect opportunity to test his theory. He convinced the Reimers to raise Bruce as a girl, renaming him Brenda, and assured them that with the right upbringing, Bruce would grow up to embrace a female identity. For years, Dr. Money documented the experiment as a success, using it to support his theories on gender. But behind the scenes, Brenda struggled deeply. She rejected feminine clothing, toys, and behaviors, and her childhood was marked by confusion and emotional pain. Dr. Money's methods, which included invasive therapy sessions, only added to the trauma. At age 14, Brenda was told the truth about her identity. She immediately chose to live as a male, renaming himself David. But the damage had already been done. David's life was marked by depression, failed relationships, and a sense of betrayal. Tragically, he took his own life in 2004. The David Reimer case exposed the dangers of unethical experimentation and the limits of scientific theories when applied to real lives. It forces us to ask, how far should science go in testing its ideas? Landis's facial expressions experiment. In the 1920s, psychology was entering a new era. Scientists were eager to understand human emotions, and the field was filled with bold, untested ideas. It was during this time that Carney Landis, a graduate student at the University of Minnesota, conducted an experiment that would forever be remembered as one of the most disturbing in the history of psychology. Landis wanted to study whether human emotions could be universally recognized through facial expressions. To do this, he recruited volunteers and subjected them to a series of emotionally charged scenarios. Participants were exposed to everything from smelling ammonia to viewing explicit images, all while their facial expressions were photographed. But the experiment took a dark turn when Landis introduced its most infamous task. Participants were handed a live rat and asked to decapitate it. Many participants hesitated, horrified by the request, but under pressure from Landis, most complied, despite their visible discomfort. Those who refused were forced to watch as Landis himself killed the rat. The experiment revealed little about facial expressions but a great deal about human behavior under authority and stress. The ethical dilemmas of Landis's experiment are glaring. Participants were subjected to psychological trauma, and animals were needlessly harmed, all in the name of science. The study was never replicated, and its findings were largely dismissed, but its legacy remains a chilling reminder of how far researchers were willing to go in pursuit of answers. Landis's facial expressions experiment forces us to confront the darker side of scientific curiosity. It raises critical questions: should the pursuit of knowledge ever come at the expense of morality, and how do we ensure that science remains humane? MK-Ultra. The CIA's secret mind control experiments. Imagine you wake up in a hospital bed, disoriented and confused. You don't remember how you got there. Doctors in white coats hover over you, injecting something into your arm. Hours later, your mind feels like it's slipping away. Memories erased, thoughts scrambled. What if I told you this wasn't a nightmare, but a real experiment conducted by the CIA? This was MK-Ultra, a top-secret program launched by the CIA in the 1950s during the height of the Cold War, to develop mind control techniques that could be used against enemies or even to create programmed assassins. The agency believed that by manipulating the human mind they could gain a strategic advantage in the shadowy world of espionage. To achieve this, the CIA conducted experiments on unwitting subjects, including prisoners, mental health patients, and even ordinary citizens. They were exposed to high doses of LSD, subjected to sleep deprivation, hypnosis, and electroshock therapy. Some were kept in isolation for weeks, their minds pushed to the brink of collapse. The experiments were often conducted without consent, leaving participants traumatized and in some cases permanently damaged. MK-Ultra was shrouded in secrecy for decades, but in the 1970s, investigative journalists and whistleblowers exposed the program, leading to its termination. The ethical violations were staggering: the lack of informed consent, the psychological and physical harm inflicted, and the blatant disregard for human rights. Today, MK-Ultra serves as a chilling reminder of how far governments can go in the name of national security. The Aversion Project. Imagine you're strapped to a chair, wires attached to your body. A doctor stands over you, telling you that your feelings are wrong, unnatural. Suddenly, a jolt of electricity courses through you. The pain is unbearable, but they say it's for your own good. What would you do if therapy became torture? This was the horrifying reality of the Aversion Project, conducted in South Africa during the 1970s and 1980s under the apartheid regime. The goal: to cure homosexuality in soldiers and civilians through aversion therapy. The project was led by Dr. Aubrey Levin, a military psychiatrist who believed that homosexuality was a disease that could be eradicated. Participants, many of whom were young conscripts forced into the military, were subjected to chemical castration, electric shocks, and hormone treatments. Some were even forced to undergo gender reassignment surgeries without their consent. The methods were brutal, and the psychological scars ran deep. Victims were left traumatized, their identities shattered, and their lives forever altered. The Aversion Project was eventually exposed in the 1990s during South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The revelations shocked the world, highlighting the extent of human rights abuses carried out in the name of science and social conformity. The ethical violations were staggering: lack of consent, inhumane treatment, and the use of science to enforce prejudice. Today, the Aversion Project stands as a grim reminder of how science can be weaponized to oppress and harm. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How do we ensure that science serves humanity, not destroys it? And how do we protect vulnerable populations from being exploited in the name of progress? Harlow's monkey experiments. What if you were taken from your mother at birth and left alone, with nothing but a cold, lifeless object to comfort you? How would it shape your ability to love, trust, or even survive? This was the haunting reality for the infant monkeys in Harry Harlow's infamous experiments. In the 1950s and 60s, psychologist Harry Harlow set out to study the nature of love and attachment. At the time, many scientists believed that affection was merely a biological response to being fed. Harlow wanted to prove that love was far more complex. To do this, he conducted a series of experiments on baby rhesus monkeys that would forever change the field of psychology and spark outrage. Harlow separated infant monkeys from their mothers and placed them in cages with two surrogate mothers. One was made of wire and provided food, while the other was soft and covered in cloth but offered no nourishment. The results were shocking. The baby monkeys clung to the cloth mother for comfort, even when the wire mother provided food. This demonstrated that emotional connection, not just physical needs, was crucial for development. But Harlow didn't stop there. He subjected the monkeys to extreme isolation, keeping them in solitary confinement for months or even years. The results were devastating. The isolated monkeys became withdrawn, unable to socialize, and exhibited severe psychological distress. Many never recovered. Harlow's experiments revealed the importance of love and attachment, but at a tremendous ethical cost. They raised profound questions about the treatment of animals in research and the lengths scientists should go to uncover the truth. What do you think? Should the pursuit of knowledge ever come at such a high price? The fake data scandal. In the early 20th century, the world was captivated by the idea of nature versus nurture. Could intelligence be inherited, or was it shaped by environment? This question became the foundation of psychologist Cyril Burt's groundbreaking twin studies. But what if the data that shaped decades of scientific thought was nothing more than a lie? Cyril Burt, a British psychologist, rose to prominence in the mid-1900s for his research on intelligence. He claimed to have studied identical twins who were separated at birth and raised in different environments. His findings were astonishing. Intelligence, he argued, was almost entirely determined by genetics, with little influence from upbringing. These results supported the growing belief in eugenics, a movement that sought to improve humanity by controlling reproduction. For years, Burt's work was celebrated, influencing education policies and societal attitudes toward intelligence. But in the 1970s, cracks began to appear. Researchers noticed inconsistencies in his data. The number of twins in his studies kept increasing, yet no one could verify their existence. Even more suspicious, Burt's two research assistants who supposedly helped collect the data were found to be fictional. The scandal rocked the scientific community. Burt's data was revealed to be fabricated, and his conclusions were discredited. The ethical implications were staggering. How many policies and beliefs had been shaped by false information, and how could science recover from such a betrayal? The Cyril Burt scandal serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of integrity in research. It reminds us that science is built on trust, and when that trust is broken, the consequences can ripple through society for generations. What do you think? How can we ensure that science remains honest and accountable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The Rosenhan experiment. Imagine you walk into a psychiatric hospital, perfectly sane, but you tell the staff you're hearing voices. They admit you, and suddenly everything you do, every word, every action, is seen as a symptom of mental illness. Days turn into weeks, and no one believes you're sane. How would you prove your sanity? This was the premise of the Rosenhan experiment, conducted in 1973 by psychologist David Rosenhan. The goal, to test the reliability of psychiatric diagnoses and expose flaws in the mental health system. Rosenhan and 7 other pseudo-patients faked symptoms of schizophrenia, claiming to hear words like empty and thud. Once admitted, they acted completely normal, waiting to see how long it would take for the staff to realize the truth. The results were shocking. None of the pseudo-patients were identified as imposters by the hospital staff. Instead, their normal behaviors, like writing in a journal, were interpreted as symptoms of their supposed illness. Some were kept in the hospitals for weeks, and all were discharged with diagnoses of schizophrenia in remission, implying they were still mentally ill. The experiment exposed serious flaws in psychiatry, highlighting how labels could overshadow a person's true behavior. But it also raised ethical questions. Was it right to deceive medical professionals and take up resources meant for real patients? And what about the impact on the pseudo-patients, who reported feeling powerless and dehumanized during their stays? The Rosenhan experiment forced the psychiatric field to confront its shortcomings and sparked debates about how mental illness is diagnosed and treated. But it also left us with a haunting question: how do we define sanity, and who gets to decide? Facilitated communication. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a wave of hope swept through the world of special education. For families of nonverbal individuals with autism, a revolutionary method called facilitated communication, FC, promised to break the silence. Imagine being told that your child, who had never spoken a word, could now express their deepest thoughts. It felt like a miracle, but what if it wasn't real? Facilitated communication was introduced as a way for nonverbal individuals to communicate by typing or pointing to letters with the help of a facilitator. The facilitator would guide their hand, and suddenly these individuals were producing full sentences, sharing emotions, and even recounting traumatic experiences. For many, it seemed like a breakthrough in understanding autism. But as FC gained popularity, doubts began to surface. Could these individuals truly communicate? Or were the facilitators unknowingly influencing their responses? Researchers conducted controlled experiments to find out. In one study, participants and facilitators were shown different images. When asked to describe the images, the answers always matched what the facilitator had seen, not the participant. The results were undeniable. Facilitated communication was a sham. The method had given false hope to families and in some cases caused irreparable harm. False accusations of abuse based on FC tore families apart. Vulnerable individuals were used as tools in a pseudo-scientific practice that lacked any real evidence. The facilitated communication scandal serves as a stark reminder of the importance of scientific rigor and ethical responsibility. It forces us to ask, how do we protect the vulnerable from unproven methods? And how do we ensure that science remains a force for truth and progress? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The Hawthorne effect. In the 1920s, America was roaring with industrial growth. Factories were booming, and businesses were desperate to find ways to boost worker productivity. At the Hawthorne Works, a massive factory in Illinois, researchers set out to uncover the secret to a more efficient workforce. But what they discovered wasn't what they expected, and it would change the way we think about human behavior forever. The Hawthorne experiment began as a study on workplace conditions. Researchers wanted to see if changes in lighting would affect worker productivity. They increased the brightness in one area of the factory, and productivity went up. But then something strange happened. When they dimmed the lights, productivity still went up. Confused, the researchers tried other changes: longer breaks, shorter breaks, different work hours, and every time, productivity improved. The results baffled the researchers until they realized the truth. It wasn't the changes in conditions that mattered. It was the fact that the workers knew they were being observed. This phenomenon, where people alter their behavior simply because they're being watched, became known as the Hawthorne effect. While the experiment wasn't unethical in the traditional sense, it raised questions about the reliability of research when participants are aware of being studied. The findings were also widely misinterpreted, leading to decades of flawed management practices based on incomplete data. The Hawthorne effect reminds us of the complexities of human behavior and the challenges of conducting unbiased research. The marshmallow test. Imagine you're a child sitting in a room, staring at a single marshmallow on a plate. A researcher tells you, if you wait 15 minutes without eating it, you'll get 2 marshmallows. The door closes, and you're left alone. What would you do? Would you wait, or give in to temptation? This was the premise of the famous marshmallow test, conducted in the 1960s by psychologist Walter Mischel. The goal? To study self-control and its impact on future success. Hundreds of preschoolers participated, and the results seemed groundbreaking. Children who resisted the marshmallow were found to have better life outcomes, higher test scores, better jobs, and even healthier relationships. The study became a symbol of the power of willpower and delayed gratification. But what if the story isn't as simple as it seems? Decades later, researchers revisited the marshmallow test and uncovered a hidden truth. The children's ability to wait wasn't just about self-control, it was also influenced by their environment. Kids from wealthier, more stable homes were more likely to wait, while those from less secure backgrounds often ate the marshmallow. Why? Because for them, trusting that the second marshmallow would come wasn't guaranteed. This revelation turned the experiment on its head, raising ethical questions about how we interpret and apply scientific findings. Was it fair to label children as successful or impulsive without considering their circumstances? And how many policies and beliefs were shaped by an incomplete understanding of the data? The marshmallow test reminds us that science is rarely black and white. It challenges us to dig deeper, question assumptions, and consider the broader context. What do you think? Is self-control the key to success, or is the story more complicated? The Robbers Cave Experiment. Imagine you're at summer camp, surrounded by kids your age. At first, everything seems normal. Games, campfires, and fun. But then something changes. Rivalries form, tempers flare, and suddenly it's not just a camp anymore, it's a battlefield. What if I told you this chaos wasn't an accident, but part of a carefully planned experiment? This was the Robbers Cave Experiment, conducted in 1954 by psychologist Muzafer Sherif. The goal, to study how group conflict arises and how it can be resolved. Sherif and his team brought 22 boys, all strangers, to a summer camp in Oklahoma. They were split into 2 groups, the Rattlers and the Eagles, and kept apart for the first week to bond with their own group. Then the researchers introduced competition. The two groups were pitted against each other in games like tug-of-war and baseball, with prizes for the winners. The results were shocking. The boys quickly turned hostile, vandalizing each other's cabins, stealing property, and even engaging in physical fights. The researchers had successfully created conflict, but at what cost? In the final phase, Sheriff attempted to resolve the tension by introducing tasks that required cooperation, like fixing a broken water supply. Slowly, the boys began to work together, and the hostility faded. The experiment demonstrated how easily group conflict can be created, and how it can be resolved through shared goals. But the ethical questions remain. Was it right to manipulate children into conflict for the sake of science? And what does this experiment say about the roots of prejudice and division in our world today? The Robbers Cave experiment forces us to reflect on the power of group dynamics and the responsibility of researchers. The third wave experiment. In the 1960s, the world was still grappling with the horrors of World War II. People asked, how could ordinary citizens fall under the spell of fascism? Could it happen again? In a small California high school, one teacher decided to find out, and what unfolded shocked everyone. It was 1967, and history teacher Ron Jones wanted to teach his students about the rise of Nazi Germany. When one student asked how so many Germans could blindly follow Hitler, Jones decided to demonstrate instead of explain. He created the third wave, a social experiment that would spiral out of control. Jones began by instilling discipline. He enforced strict rules, demanded perfect posture, and introduced a salute. The students, to his surprise, embraced it. They felt a sense of unity and purpose. Over the next few days, the experiment grew. Students recruited others, created slogans, and even spied on classmates who broke the rules. What started as a lesson in history became a chilling display of how easily people can be drawn into authoritarianism. By the end of the week, the movement had grown so large that Jones decided to end it. He gathered the students and revealed the truth. The third wave was an experiment to show how fascism takes root. The students were stunned, many in tears, realizing how quickly they had abandoned their individuality and critical thinking. The third wave experiment raises profound ethical questions. Was it right to manipulate students to teach a lesson? And what does it say about our susceptibility to authority and groupthink? Even today, the experiment serves as a warning about the fragility of democracy and the importance of questioning authority. The Pit of Despair. Harlow's most disturbing experiment. In the 1960s, psychology was pushing boundaries, often at the expense of ethics. Researchers were obsessed with understanding the human mind, and one man, Harry Harlow, was determined to uncover the darkest corners of emotional attachment. But what he did in the name of science would shock the world. Harlow had already gained fame for his experiments on love and attachment using baby monkeys. But his next study, chillingly nicknamed the Pit of Despair, took a far darker turn. Harlow wanted to study the effects of extreme isolation on mental health. To do this, he built a small, dark metal chamber, a vertical cage with slanted walls, and placed baby monkeys inside, completely alone, for weeks or even months. The results were devastating. The monkeys, deprived of any social interaction, quickly descended into despair. They stopped moving, refused to eat, and displayed signs of severe psychological trauma. Some never recovered, even after being reintroduced to other monkeys. Harlow's findings revealed the profound importance of social bonds, but at an unimaginable cost. The experiment sparked outrage. Critics condemned Harlow's methods as cruel and unnecessary, arguing that the suffering inflicted on the monkeys far outweighed the scientific insights gained. The study became a symbol of the ethical failures of psychological research in the mid-20th century. Today, the Pit of Despair serves as a grim reminder of the need for ethical boundaries in science. It forces us to ask, how far should we go in the pursuit of knowledge? And can the ends ever justify the means when the cost is so high? Harlow's work changed how we understand mental health and attachment, but it also left a dark stain on the history of psychology. The bystander effect. In the early hours of March 13, 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was brutally attacked outside her apartment in Queens, New York. She screamed for help, her cries echoing through the neighborhood. But no one came to her aid. The story shocked the nation. 38 witnesses reportedly heard her screams, yet no one intervened. How could so many people do nothing? This tragedy inspired psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latané to investigate what became known as the bystander effect. Their goal, to understand why people fail to act in emergencies when others are present. In a series of experiments, they recreated scenarios where participants believed someone needed help, like hearing a person having a seizure or seeing smoke fill a room. The results were startling. The more people present, the less likely anyone was to help. Responsibility, it seemed, was diffused among the group. The findings were groundbreaking, but they also raised ethical questions. Participants were often placed in stressful situations, believing they were witnessing real emergencies. Was it right to manipulate people's emotions to study their behavior? And what about the societal implications of labeling people as apathetic or uncaring? Over time, the story of Kitty Genovese was revealed to be more complex. Many neighbors did try to help, but the narrative of inaction stuck, fueling decades of research into human behavior. The bystander effect remains a powerful concept, shaping how we understand group dynamics and moral responsibility. This experiment forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about ourselves. Would you act in an emergency, or assume someone else would? And how can we overcome the barriers that stop us from helping others? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The Minnesota starvation experiment. In the 1940s, the world was at war, and millions were starving across Europe and Asia. As World War II came to an end, one question loomed large. How could the world help people recover from starvation? To find answers, scientists turned to an extraordinary and controversial experiment, one that would push human endurance to its limits. In 1944, physiologist Anchel Keys launched the Minnesota starvation experiment. The goal, to study the physical and psychological effects of starvation and determine the best ways to rehabilitate those who had suffered from extreme hunger. 36 healthy young men, all conscientious objectors to the war, volunteered for the study, willing to endure months of suffering in the name of science. For 6 months, the men were placed on a semi-starvation diet, consuming just 1,500 calories a day, half of what they needed. The effects were devastating. The men lost nearly 25% of their body weight, became weak, irritable, and depressed. Some developed obsessive behaviors, hoarding food or fantasizing about meals. Their mental health deteriorated, with some experiencing severe emotional breakdowns. The experiment revealed critical insights into the effects of starvation and how to safely reintroduce food. But it also raised ethical questions. Was it right to subject volunteers to such extreme suffering, even with their consent? And what about the long-term psychological toll on the participants? The Minnesota starvation experiment remains a landmark study in understanding hunger, but it also serves as a reminder of the ethical dilemmas in human research. It forces us to ask, how far should science go to solve humanity's greatest challenges? And can the ends ever justify the means? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Blue eyes versus brown eyes. The classroom experiment. In 1968, the world was reeling from the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The fight for civil rights was at its peak, and questions about racism and prejudice were on everyone's minds. In a small classroom in Iowa, one teacher decided to teach her students a lesson they would never forget, by dividing them. Jane Elliott, a third-grade teacher, wanted her students to understand the impact of discrimination. She devised a bold and controversial experiment. One morning, she told her class that children with blue eyes were superior to those with brown eyes. Blue-eyed kids were given special privileges, extra recess time, front-row seats and praise, while brown-eyed kids were treated as inferior, forced to sit in the back, and even made to wear collars to mark their lower status. The results were immediate and shocking. The blue-eyed children became arrogant and bossy, while the brown-eyed children grew withdrawn and insecure. The next day, Elliott reversed the roles, making the blue-eyed kids the inferior group. The same patterns emerged, showing how quickly prejudice could take hold. The experiment was groundbreaking, But it wasn't without controversy. Critics argued that it was unethical to subject children to such emotional stress, even for a day. Some students reported feeling humiliated and traumatized, though many later said the lesson profoundly shaped their understanding of racism. The blue eyes versus brown eyes experiment remains a powerful example of how easily discrimination can be created and how deeply it can affect people. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and privilege, but it also raises questions: should such lessons come at the expense of children's emotional well-being? Operation Midnight Climax. In the 1950s, the Cold War was in full swing, and paranoia gripped the United States. The CIA feared that Soviet spies were using mind control to manipulate people. Desperate to stay ahead, they launched a series of secret experiments under the infamous MK-Ultra program. One of the most bizarre and controversial of these was Operation Midnight Climax. Imagine you're sitting in a dimly lit room, sipping a drink. Unbeknownst to you, it's laced with LSD. Behind a two-way mirror, CIA agents watch your every move, taking notes as the drug takes hold. This wasn't a spy thriller, it was real. Operation Midnight Climax began in 1954. The CIA set up safe houses in San Francisco and New York, disguised as brothels. Sex workers secretly on the CIA's payroll were instructed to lure unsuspecting men to these locations. Once inside, the men were given drinks spiked with LSD, and their behavior was observed. The goal? To study the effects of the drug and explore its potential for mind control and interrogation. The experiment was as unethical as it was shocking. The men had no idea they were being drugged or studied. Their privacy and consent were completely disregarded. The agents running the operation, led by George Hunter White, often treated it as a joke, even hosting parties in the safe houses. Operation Midnight Climax was eventually shut down in the mid-1960s after public outrage over MK-Ultra's broader abuses. It remains a chilling example of how far governments can go in the name of national security. This experiment forces us to ask, how do we hold institutions accountable for unethical behavior? And how do we ensure that science and power are used responsibly? The Asch conformity experiment. What if you were in a room full of people, and everyone insisted that 2 + 2 = 5? Would you trust your own eyes, or go along with the crowd? This is the unsettling question at the heart of one of psychology's most famous experiments, the Asch conformity experiment. In the 1950s, during a time when conformity and social norms were under intense scrutiny, psychologist Solomon Asch set out to study how peer pressure influences decision-making. The setup was simple but brilliant. Participants were placed in a room with a group of people who were secretly working with the experimenter. They were shown a series of lines, and asked to match one line to another of the same length. The task was easy, until the group started giving obviously wrong answers. The real participant, seated near the end of the line, was faced with a dilemma: trust their own judgment or conform to the group. Shockingly, about 75% of participants conformed at least once, even when the group's answers were clearly incorrect. The experiment revealed just how powerful social pressure can be, even when it goes against our better judgment. While the Asch experiment didn't involve physical harm, it raised ethical questions about the emotional stress placed on participants. How does it feel to doubt your own reality? And what does this say about our willingness to sacrifice truth for social acceptance? The Asch conformity experiment forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: we're more influenced by others than we'd like to admit. It challenges us to think critically and stand firm in our beliefs, even when the crowd disagrees. The Marsh Chapel experiment. In the 1960s, the world was undergoing a cultural revolution. The counterculture movement was in full swing, and psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin were being hailed as tools for expanding the mind. But what if these substances could also unlock profound spiritual experiences? This question led to one of the most unusual and controversial experiments in psychology, the Marsh Chapel experiment. In 1962, Harvard psychologist Walter Pahnke set out to explore whether psychedelics could induce genuine mystical experiences. The setting: A Good Friday service at Boston University's Marsh Chapel. 20 theology students were recruited for the study. Half were given psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, while the other half received a placebo. Neither group knew which they had taken. As the service unfolded, the results were dramatic. Many of the psilocybin group reported profound spiritual experiences, visions, feelings of unity, and a deep sense of connection to the divine. Some described it as the most meaningful event of their lives. Meanwhile, the placebo group experienced little more than the usual solemnity of a church service. The experiment was groundbreaking, but it raised serious ethical questions. Was it right to administer powerful hallucinogens without fully understanding their long-term effects? And what about the participants who experienced fear or distress during their trips? The study also sparked controversy in the religious community, with some questioning whether chemically induced experiences could truly be considered spiritual. The Marsh Chapel experiment remains a fascinating chapter in the study of psychedelics and spirituality. It challenges us to rethink the boundaries between science, religion, and human consciousness. What do you think? Can science and spirituality coexist, or should some questions remain unanswered? Learned helplessness experiment. In the 1960s, psychology was undergoing a revolution. Researchers were delving into the human mind, exploring how behavior could be shaped by rewards, punishments, and fear. It was during this time that psychologist Martin Seligman conducted an experiment that would forever change our understanding of despair and resilience. But the methods he used were as shocking as the results. Imagine this. A dog is placed in a cage with a metal floor. Without warning, an electric shock is delivered. The dog tries to escape, but there's no way out. The shocks keep coming, and eventually the dog stops trying. Even when the cage door is opened, the dog doesn't move. It has learned that nothing it does will make a difference. This was the essence of Seligman's learned helplessness experiment. He and his team divided dogs into 3 groups. One that could escape the shocks by pressing a lever, one that had no control over the shocks, and a control group that wasn't shocked at all. The dogs that couldn't escape developed a sense of helplessness, refusing to act even when escape was possible. The experiment revealed how a lack of control can lead to feelings of helplessness and depression, insights that transformed psychology and led to breakthroughs in understanding mental health. But the ethical dilemmas were glaring. The dogs endured significant suffering, raising questions about the morality of using animals in such experiments. Learned helplessness remains a cornerstone of psychological research, but it also forces us to confront the cost of scientific progress. How do we balance the pursuit of knowledge with the responsibility to minimize harm? The car crash experiment. What if I told you that your memories, those vivid, detailed snapshots of your life, could be altered with just a few words? Imagine witnessing a car crash, then being asked a simple question. Could the way it's phrased change what you remember? This is the unsettling premise of the car crash experiment. In 1974, psychologists Elizabeth Loftus and John Palmer set out to explore how language influences memory. They showed participants videos of car accidents and then asked them to estimate the speed of the cars. But there was a twist. The researchers used different verbs in their questions. Some participants were asked, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other, while others heard the word hit or contacted. The results were shocking. Participants who heard the word smashed gave higher speed estimates than those who heard hit or contacted. Even more startling, when asked a week later, those in the smashed group were more likely to falsely remember seeing broken glass at the scene, despite there being none. The experiment revealed how easily memories can be manipulated, raising profound questions about the reliability of eyewitness testimony. If a single word can alter what we remember, how much of our past is truly accurate? And what are the ethical implications of using this knowledge in legal or psychological settings? The car crash experiment changed the way we understand memory, but it also forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how fragile and malleable our minds can be. It challenges us to think critically about the power of suggestion and the responsibility that comes with it. What do you think? Can we ever fully trust our memories? The sleep deprivation experiment. You're sitting in a brightly lit room, surrounded by researchers. Cameras are watching your every move. Your eyes burn, your body aches, and your mind feels like it's unraveling. You haven't slept in days, and the world around you starts to blur. How long could you last? This was the reality for Randy Gardner, a 17-year-old high school student who, in 1964, set out to break the world record for sleep deprivation. Under the supervision of researchers, Gardner stayed awake for an astonishing 11 days, 264 hours, pushing the limits of human endurance. But what happened to his mind and body during this time shocked the world. At first, Gardner experienced mild symptoms, fatigue, irritability, and difficulty focusing. But as the days went on, the effects became more severe. He started hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. His speech slurred, his memory faltered, and he struggled to perform simple tasks. By the final days, he was barely coherent, teetering on the edge of psychosis. The experiment revealed the devastating effects of sleep deprivation on the human brain and body. It highlighted how essential sleep is for mental and physical health. But it also raised ethical questions. Should researchers have allowed a teenager to push himself to such dangerous extremes? And what are the long-term consequences of such experiments? While Randy Gardner recovered fully, the experiment remains a controversial chapter in the study of sleep. It forces us to ask, how far should we go to understand the limits of human endurance? And what does this tell us about the importance of rest in our fast-paced world? The Tear Room Trade Study. In the 1960s, America was a nation in flux. The sexual revolution was challenging societal norms, but homosexuality was still stigmatized and criminalized. It was in this tense cultural backdrop that sociologist Lard Humphreys conducted one of the most controversial studies in social science. The Tear Room Trade Study. Humphreys set out to study anonymous sexual encounters between men in public restrooms, known as tear rooms. His goal was to understand the social dynamics of these interactions and challenge stereotypes about the men involved. But the methods he used would spark outrage. Disguised as a watch queen, Humphreys observed these encounters without the participants' knowledge. He recorded their license plate numbers, tracked them down, and later visited their homes under the guise of conducting a health survey. Many of the men were married and living conventional lives, and they had no idea they were part of a study. The results were groundbreaking. Humphreys found that many of the men were not openly gay but used tear rooms as a way to explore their sexuality in secret. His work challenged the prevailing view of homosexuality as deviant and helped humanize a marginalized group. But the ethical dilemmas were glaring. Critics argued that Humphreys violated the participants' privacy and consent, putting them at risk of exposure in a time when being outed could ruin lives. The study raised serious questions about the balance between scientific discovery and the rights of research subjects. The Tear Room Trade Study remains a landmark in sociology, but it also serves as a cautionary tale about the ethics of research. It forces us to ask, how far should scientists go to uncover the truth, and can the ends ever justify the means? The tragic case of Jeannie. In the 1970s, the world was captivated by a shocking discovery. A 13-year-old girl known as Jeannie had been found in Los Angeles, locked in a small room, isolated and abused for most of her life. She couldn't speak, walk properly, or interact with others. Her tragic story would become one of the most controversial cases in the history of psychology. Jeannie's father had kept her in near total isolation, believing she was mentally disabled. She was tied to a potty chair, fed minimal food, and forbidden from making noise. When authorities rescued her, scientists saw an unprecedented opportunity to study the effects of extreme deprivation on human development. Could Jeannie learn language and social skills after missing the critical early years of development? Researchers, linguists, and psychologists flocked to study her. At first, progress seemed promising. Jeannie began to learn words and express herself, but her development was uneven. She never fully grasped grammar, raising questions about whether there's a critical period for language acquisition. However, as the years went on, the focus shifted from helping Jeannie to using her as a research subject. The ethical dilemmas were glaring. Jeannie was moved between foster homes, often experiencing further trauma. The researchers' competing interests led to conflicts, and eventually the funding for her care ran out. Jeannie was abandoned by the very people who claimed to want to help her. Today, she lives in a private care facility, her story a haunting reminder of science gone wrong. The case of Jeannie forces us to confront difficult questions. How do we balance the pursuit of knowledge with the responsibility to protect vulnerable individuals? The Willowbrook hepatitis study. In the 1950s, hepatitis outbreaks were rampant in institutions for the mentally disabled. At Willowbrook State School in New York, overcrowding and unsanitary conditions made the disease almost unavoidable. But instead of improving conditions, researchers saw an opportunity to study the disease, using the children as test subjects. The Willowbrook hepatitis study began in 1956, led by Dr. Saul Krugman. Researchers deliberately infected healthy children with hepatitis, claiming it was necessary to study the disease's progression and develop a vaccine. Parents were often misled, told their children would receive better care if they participated. In reality, the children endured painful symptoms, including jaundice, fever, and vomiting, all while confined to the institution. The study continued for over 14 years, despite growing criticism. The ethical dilemmas were glaring. The children, many of whom had intellectual disabilities, could not consent, and their parents were not fully informed. Critics argued that the researchers exploited a vulnerable population, prioritizing science over humanity. The Willowbrook study was eventually shut down in the 1970s, but its legacy remains a dark chapter in medical history. It forced the medical community to confront the need for stricter ethical guidelines, leading to the development of informed consent laws and the establishment of institutional review boards. Today, the Willowbrook hepatitis study serves as a grim reminder of the dangers of exploiting vulnerable populations in the name of science. The Guatemala syphilis experiment. In the 1940s, as the world was recovering from World War II, the United States was conducting secret medical experiments in Guatemala that would later be condemned as one of the darkest chapters in medical history. The Guatemala syphilis experiment was a shocking abuse of power, targeting some of the most vulnerable people in society. Between 1946 and 1948, U.S. researchers, led by Dr. John Cutler, deliberately infected over 1,500 Guatemalan men, women and children with syphilis and other sexually transmitted diseases. The participants included prisoners, sex workers, soldiers, and even patients in mental health institutions. Many were unaware they were part of an experiment, and some were intentionally exposed to the diseases through injections or forced sexual encounters. The goal of the study was to test the effectiveness of penicillin in treating syphilis. However, many participants were left untreated, suffering severe health consequences. Some died as a result of the infections, while others endured lifelong complications. The experiment was conducted without informed consent, violating basic human rights and ethical standards. The Guatemala syphilis experiment remained hidden for decades until it was uncovered in 2010. The revelation sparked international outrage, leading to formal apologies from the US government. However, for many victims and their families, the damage was irreversible. This experiment serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power in science. It forces us to confront the ethical failures of the past and ask, how do we ensure that such atrocities never happen again? And how do we hold institutions accountable for the harm they cause? Facebook's emotional contagion study. What if your emotions weren't entirely your own? What if the posts you see on social media could subtly change how you feel, without you even realizing it? This isn't science fiction, it's the unsettling reality of Facebook's emotional contagion study. In 2012, Facebook conducted a secret experiment on nearly 700,000 users. The goal, to see if emotions could spread through social media. For 1 week, Facebook manipulated users' news feeds. Some saw mostly positive posts, while others saw mostly negative ones. The researchers wanted to know, would this affect the tone of the user's own posts? The results were startling. Users exposed to more positive content were more likely to post positive updates, while those shown negative content posted more negatively. The study revealed that emotions can indeed be contagious, even in the digital world. But when the experiment was revealed in 2014, it sparked outrage. Users had no idea they were part of a psychological study. Critics argued that Facebook had violated their trust and manipulated their emotions without consent. Was it ethical to experiment on people without their knowledge, even if the harm seemed minimal. The emotional contagion study raises profound questions about the power of social media. If platforms can influence our emotions, what else can they control? And how do we protect ourselves from being unknowingly manipulated? This experiment forces us to think critically about the role of technology in our lives. Are we in control of our emotions, or is someone else pulling the strings? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The replication crisis. What if the foundations of modern psychology were built on shaky ground? What if the studies we've trusted for decades couldn't be replicated? This is the unsettling reality of the replication crisis. In the early 2010s, researchers began to notice a troubling trend. When they tried to replicate some of psychology's most famous experiments, the results didn't hold up. Studies that had shaped our understanding of human behavior, like the power of willpower, implicit bias, and even social priming, were suddenly called into question. The crisis came to a head in 2015, when a massive project attempted to replicate 100 psychology studies. Shockingly, only 39% produced the same results as the original research. The findings sent shockwaves through the scientific community, raising questions about the reliability of psychological research. Why were so many studies failing? Researchers pointed to issues like small sample sizes, publication bias, and pressure to produce groundbreaking results. Some even accused scientists of cherry-picking data or using questionable methods to achieve statistically significant results. The replication crisis has forced psychology to confront its flaws and rethink how research is conducted. But it also raises deeper questions. How do we rebuild trust in science, and how do we ensure that future studies are rigorous, transparent, and reliable? This crisis reminds us that science is a process, not a destination. It's messy, imperfect, and constantly evolving. What do you think? Can psychology recover from the replication crisis? The power pose study. Imagine you're about to walk into a job interview. You're nervous, your palms are sweaty, and your confidence is fading. But then you remember a tip you read online. Stand tall, spread your arms, and strike a power pose. In just 2 minutes, you'll feel more confident and ready to conquer the world. But what if this viral advice wasn't as powerful as it seemed? In 2010, social psychologist Amy Cuddy and her colleagues published a study claiming that power poses could boost confidence and even change hormone levels. The idea was simple. Adopting expansive dominant postures for just 2 minutes could increase testosterone, lower cortisol, and make you feel more powerful. The study went viral, sparking TED Talks, self-help books, and countless articles. But as the years went on, cracks began to appear. Researchers struggled to replicate the study's results. Critics pointed out flaws in the methodology, including small sample sizes and questionable statistical practices. By 2016, one of Cuddy's co-authors publicly distanced himself from the original claims, admitting that the evidence wasn't as strong as they had initially thought. The power pose study became a symbol of the replication crisis in psychology, raising questions about how easily flawed research can spread and influence public behavior. While some still believe in the psychological benefits of power poses, the scientific community remains divided. This study forces us to ask, how do we separate good science from bad? And how do we ensure that popular psychology trends are backed by solid evidence? The implicit association test. What if I told you that your deepest biases, ones you don't even know you have, could be revealed in just a few minutes? This is the promise of the implicit association test, IAT, a tool designed to uncover hidden prejudices. But can it really measure bias, or is it just an illusion? The IAT was developed in the 1990s by psychologists Anthony Greenwald and Mahzarin Banaji. The test works by measuring how quickly you associate certain words or images with positive or negative concepts. For example, it might ask you to pair good words with faces of different races. The idea is that faster responses indicate unconscious preferences or biases. The IAT quickly became a sensation, used in diversity training, hiring practices, and even courtrooms. It seemed to offer a window into the hidden workings of the human mind. But as its popularity grew, so did the controversy. Critics argue that the IAT's results are inconsistent and don't reliably predict behavior. Just because someone shows a bias on the test doesn't mean they'll act on it in real life. Others question whether the test measures bias at all, or simply reflects cultural stereotypes. The implicit association test raises profound questions about how we understand and address prejudice. Can a single test truly capture the complexity of human bias? And how do we balance the need for tools like the IAT with the responsibility to use them ethically? This experiment challenges us to think critically about the tools we use to understand ourselves. What do you think? Is the IAT a breakthrough or a flawed idea? Let us know in the comments below. The Google AI ethics controversy. In the 21st century, artificial intelligence has revolutionized the way we live, work, and think. But as AI grows more powerful, so do the ethical dilemmas surrounding its use. One of the most controversial moments in AI history came in 2020, when Google faced backlash over its handling of AI ethics research. The controversy began when Dr. Timnit Gebru, a leading AI ethics researcher at Google, co-authored a paper highlighting the risks of large language models, AI systems like the ones that power search engines and chatbots. The paper warned about biases in AI, environmental costs, and the potential for misuse. But instead of fostering open dialogue, Google demanded the paper be withdrawn. When Gebru refused, she was abruptly fired. The incident sparked outrage in the tech and academic communities. Critics accused Google of silencing dissent and prioritizing profits over ethical concerns. The controversy highlighted the growing tension between advancing AI technology and addressing its societal impact. The Google AI ethics controversy forces us to confront difficult questions. Who gets to decide how AI is developed and used? And how do we ensure that technology serves humanity, not just corporate interests? As AI continues to shape our world, this controversy reminds us of the importance of transparency, accountability, and ethical responsibility. What do you think? Can we trust tech giants to regulate themselves, or do we need stronger oversight? TikTok mental health trends. Imagine you're scrolling through TikTok, and a video pops up. The creator lists symptoms of ADHD, anxiety, or depression, and suddenly, it feels like they're describing you. You start to wonder, do I have this? Should I get help? But what if the information you're seeing isn't accurate, or even harmful? In recent years, TikTok has become a hub for mental health content. Creators share personal stories, symptoms, and advice, often reaching millions of viewers. While this has helped reduce stigma and encouraged people to seek help, it's also led to a troubling trend: self-diagnosis. Many TikTok videos oversimplify complex mental health conditions, presenting symptoms without context or nuance. This can lead viewers to misdiagnose themselves, or believe they have a disorder they don't. Worse, some creators promote unproven treatments or spread misinformation, putting vulnerable viewers at risk. The rise of TikTok mental health trends raises serious ethical questions. Should social media platforms do more to regulate health-related content? And how do we balance the benefits of raising awareness with the dangers of misinformation? This trend forces us to reflect on the role of social media in shaping our understanding of mental health. How do we ensure that people get accurate information and proper care? And how do we protect vulnerable individuals from the risks of self-diagnosis? What do you think? Is TikTok helping or hurting the mental health conversation? Let us know in the comments below.
Don't forget to like and subscribe.